This is Real History with Melissa, and I am Melissa. And today is the 16th of April, 2026, and I am back with Dr. James Giordano. Now, if you're tuning in to this episode and you didn't see the last one, I will supply his bio or CV or resume. It's a small book, so you can read that yourselves. But I will say that currently he is the director at the Center for Disruptive Technologies and Future Warfare, Institute for National Strategic Studies, National Defense University. He calls that his retirement job. So, good morning.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. I'm well.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming back. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, throw. So, what shall we chat about today?
Well, I have a few just little background questions out of curiosity. So I'll start with you mentioned in several interviews that your father was a submarine designer.
He was. Yeah, he worked for American Electric Boat. He worked on a number of projects during the late 50s and 60s. Probably the one that was the most notable was the USS Nautilus, which was the first nuclear-powered submarine to be able to traverse the Arctic under the ice cap. Worked on the Skipjack Seawolf project. Also worked on one of the first surface vessels, one of the first commercial surface vessels, which was, I believe, called the Atlanta. But yeah, he worked for American Electric Boat.
Was he military or
He
was this
was.
a civilian? Okay.
No, he was former Navy. He got into the United States Navy. He enlisted in the late 1940s and was Pacific tour pretty much at the end of the Second World War, and then stayed in for a bit after that, and then left the Navy, as so many folks did during that period of time. Was sort of flirting with whether he should stay in or not. But the skills that he picked up while he was in the Navy, he then went on to the New York Institute for Drafting and Design, which ultimately became New York Institute of Technology. And that's where he took his engineering and drafting degree. And then that's what he did. And then after that, in the 1970s, he worked for E.A. DuPont because he was doing a lot of piping design and large power plant type stuff, both nuclear and conventional. So yeah, but when I was young, he was a sub designer.
Okay, interesting. Now, you have talked about your background in the Navy and the Marines, but you were, I think your first degree was biological psychology. Is that correct?
So my doctoral degree, yeah. So I did my undergraduate at St. Peter's, and that was in physiological psychology with a minor in philosophy. And then I did a master's degree at Norwich University in Vermont, and then went on to City University of New York, and originally was applying there for an MD PhD program. I absolutely fell in love with the PhD work, and it was an exciting time. I mean, it was right around the time when the field, the neurosciences, became titularly known as the neurosciences. So we're talking the late 1970s. So my collegiate experience in the neurosciences was really very much part of the whole incipient movement. I mean, obviously, people had been studying the brain since pretty much time immemorial. I had this, I tell my students, I had this vision of some early human looking into some reflecting pool and it dawning on them, wow, this is me. And then, we take these jumps through history. I mean, into the ancients, not only here in the West, but also in Asia, certainly in the Middle East. And there's been great reflection on what is brain, what is mind, who am I, what is consciousness. You fast forward into the period of the Renaissance, and you've got Descartes. Fast forward again into the first industrial and scientific revolutions, and there's real progression there. And then you get to the 20th century. I mean, I think arguably the century of science and technology, where you see the concatenation of those two. And the idea that we could study the brain utilizing a variety of tools across the sciences and increasingly in engineering really was part of the impetus to then form this field called the neurosciences. And so I think I mentioned last time when I got into the field, there were only four programs here in the United States, which basically turns me into a fossil, turns me into a dinosaur, because now there are quite frankly hundreds, and not just at the university level, certainly at the collegiate level. There are freestanding institutes and programs in the brain sciences, and it's become pretty much a global phenomenon, a global enterprise, primarily of course, among developed nations, but also in developing nations. And I think the other issue there is that the nature of power interaction, scientific and technological power interaction, also affects, at least in part, those nations that are undeveloped, developing, and using the brain sciences or having the brain sciences leveraged in some way to affect their bioeconomies. So, yeah, when I got into the field, brain sciences, neurosciences, my PhD was actually in biological psychology, with an emphasis also on neuropsychiatry. And that was at City University of New York. And we also had a program at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And that's where I did most of my research. So some of the basic research and some of the sort of preclinicals type of stuff. And then I went on and I took a postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins University, both in the School of Medicine and the School of Public Health. And that was in neuropathology and neurotoxicology. And then I went on after that and did some additional training up at Harvard in neuroimaging, advanced neuroimaging. But the other thing, I was very, very fortunate when I was at City University, to build a bit on my one of my undergraduate interests. You know, when you're a kid, there's a bit of pathos that goes into studying things like psychology or cognitive science and so forth. I mean, you know, it's not only looking at a lens; it's sort of flipping around. It's a mirror. But I was also interested very much in philosophy, the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of science, and being at City University of New York. I mean, it has a very, very rich academic culture in philosophy across the disciplines: analytic, continental, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science. I took great advantage of that and took a master's at that time.
Who are some of the philosophers that are there that, or were there, that had an influence on you?
Uh, I mean, certainly we we it was part of a larger consortium. You know, the universities in New York City, it was in Manhattan, are sort of a consortial engagement. And the City University of New York is an amalgamation of a number of small colleges: Hunter College, City College, Brooklyn College, Queens College. All of these played into sort of that larger milieu. Plus, we had the opportunity to work consortially with the Rockefeller University and Columbia, as well as NYU. And so at that time, there were also some great folks who were doing excellent work broadly in philosophy at the New School of Social Research. So, I mean, some of the big names who were in and out of the city at that time: Owen Flanagan was in and out of New York City doing some guest lecturing and had a guest professorship. Some of the work of Daniel Dennett, who, of course, is very, very well known in the field. The Churchlands, Paul Churchland, Patricia Churchland. And then, of course, the folks who were teaching me, my neuroscience courses, were done, again, consortially. So I had the great opportunity as a graduate student to work with, at that time, someone who was going to become a Nobel laureate, which was Dr. Eric Kandel. And Eric Kandel and Dr. Schwartz were up at Columbia University, and they literally wrote the book, The Principles of Neural Sciences. And Dr. Kandel was the fellow who lectured me neurophysiology, and Dr. Schwartz was lecturing me neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. So it was a very heady time. The work that I was doing was kind of focal right around that period of time. A lot was being learned about the brain's natural analgesic and pain modulating system, the idea of the endorphins and enkephalins. My doctoral mentor was absolutely wonderful. He was a young doctoral mentor. His name was Dr. Gordon Barr. He just recently retired. He was at University of Pennsylvania. He left City University and then went to University of Pennsylvania. Again, sort of late in his career, that was his retirement job. But working with Gordon allowed us, he had great connections. So we had some work with Stephen and Suzanne Zukin up at Albert Einstein. We were working with Herman van Praag, who was very, very well known for his work on the serotonin and opioid systems in psychiatry. Fernando Pasic was my professor of neuroanatomy, who's world renowned. So it was very heady. You know, it was sort of like being an academic hippie in like the early 1960s in the Village. You know, it was like, wow, you're like rubbing elbows with Dylan. I mean, it was that's what it was like.
Let me ask you,
So it was great.
you're from New York.
Yeah.
So, and your father was in the Navy and he was so you've got all of that influence. But when you were young, I mean, what was the time? Because it's like when you're young, you're like, I'm going to be a fireman, I'm going to be this. So when was the time that you sparked to the idea that you wanted to be doing brain sciences or philosophy or any of that? I mean, what was it that said, okay, you're 18 or you're 16 or whatever?
Oh, way back. Now, it's actually a very funny story. And I tell people this, like, ah, really? No, seriously, really. I was 6, and my dad, 6 or 7, and my dad took me to see a movie called Fantastic Voyage.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so Stephen
yeah,
Boyd,
yeah,
yeah, Raquel
yeah,
Welch, Donna
yeah,
Plazance,
yeah.
in the theaters. And I, again, I went with my dad, right? So he's a submarine piping designer and propulsion designer. So again, and the plot. So for your viewers and your listeners who haven't seen this movie, it was made in 1966. And given the fact that it was made in 1966, just the visual effects are phenomenal. I mean, there's obviously way before there was even the idea of CG, but it was really cool. So the whole premise basically is here's this international scientist from behind the Iron Curtain who has these very valuable secrets that are potentially military and biomedical. And he defects to the West. And while he's defecting, getting off the plane, there's an assassination attempt on his life. And it's not successful, but he does develop blood clot in his brain. And if they operate on him, what they're afraid of is he's going to not have his cognitive facilities and going to lose all this valuable information. So they decide they're going to usurp a technology that was being experimentally developed for the military where they could miniaturize military equipment to very, very small size to move whole armies, for example, in a suitcase, right? And being very avant-gardistic, they said, well, what if we were to miniaturize a group of scientists who we could then inject into this guy's body to be able to navigate to his brain and essentially parse out this blood clot, freeing up his blood flow and then not running the risk of neurosurgery. And that was the whole premise, is that they then put these folks in what was sort of a smaller, like a miniature submarine, a 5-person, 6-person submarine, miniaturize the whole thing and inject it into this guy's body. And it's done in real time. The movie was done in real time. They have about an hour before they start to deminiaturize. So I go to see this movie with my dad, and I thought, I mean, aside from the fact that I'm watching the next hour of Raquel Welch in basically a scuba suit, right, in a wetsuit. I'm like, okay, I'm 7 years old. I'm dipping into the hormone bucket early. It's like, wow, this is pretty cool. But the premise was absolutely amazing. And there's one scene where they're literally they've just entered into the brain, and again, it was prescient. I mean, if I could go back and just really just laud upon the people who developed this film, and interestingly, the book that it was based upon was an idea by the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. And Asimov didn't write a book to which the screenplay was adapted. He was consulting on the screenplay and then wrote a novella based upon the screenplay, and then subsequently, years later, went back and finished the novel that he would have wanted to write, which was equally as great. I mean, years later, 20 years later. But there's one part where they're in the brain, and as they're going through sort of the network of the fluids of the brain, they see these nerve cells and they see them sort of lighting up as these sort of chemoelectric currents are being passed all over them. And there's a wonderful little soliloquy there about where this is the human mind. It's sort of wider than the sky, which is a very Emily Dickinson quote. And that just blew me away as a kid. I mean, it totally blew me away. And I remember coming out of that movie and thinking, number one, this is the coolest thing since sliced bread because they're using all this cool military technology. Brand new technology at that time was this thing called a laser beam, like right, Dr. Evil. So this is the best thing. Now, I mean, understand, yeah, I'm 6, 7-year-old kid. I mean, all kids sort of like military stuff anyway. My dad's a submarine designer. I'm like, oh, it's great. And my dad thought it was cool because it's like submarine stuff. So I remember coming out of the movie and I told my father, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And I remember he sort of gave me a look like, yeah, right. Hey, that's what I do when I grow up. And then it was just very, very fortuitous. I was in sort of the right place at the right time.
Did you
Yeah.
did you stay on that track in your mind, like through elementary school? Through did you
Well,
never left? Yeah.
No, I mean my grandfather on my dad's side was a New York City mounted policeman for 28 years. I mean, so I mean, I grew up around. I tell people I grew up around horses in New York City, and they're like, "Yeah, right." I did grow up around horses in New York City. There was never any great burning desire to be a cop. I had some relatives on the other side of the family that were firefighters. I mean, that was pretty cool. I thought that was all right. You know, obviously my dad was an engineer and a submarine designer. My mom's dad was an automotive mechanic. He did car restoration, which is something I like to do as well. I mean, my dad and I did a lot of that kind of stuff. But it was funny. I sort of locked on to that, and it was absolutely captivating to me. I mean, there was something it had profound pathos. I mean, if a 7-year old kid can have pathos to that extent intellectually, but it was also, I just thought it was cool. I mean, it was just cool, right? And then the idea of using all these really cool tools and techniques and stuff. Plus, I had come from a family that was medical. On my mom's side, there were pharmacists and chemists. I have relatives who were physicians. So it was sort of an amalgamation of things, and it was like a spark. As they say, the rest is history.
Okay. Now, thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah, because to me, the decisions that we make when we're young, they have profound and lasting effect. And it's like, how do you make those decisions? And when I was first looking at it, and I heard you talk about your father, I thought, well, maybe you're raised with an ethic of this is what you will do. This is what the family has always done. This is, so.
Not at all. It, I spent a lot of time with my great aunt and my great uncle. Again, my background was I was raised in Manhattan. My parents lived in Manhattan, but at that time, we're talking the early 1960s. My great aunt lived in a suburb called Staten Island, which at that time was farmland. Right? So I spent a lot of time there, and they had horses too. And my great aunt and great uncle were very sort of encouraging. Any basically, what are you interested in, and whatever. And, so even the hobbies I had when I was a kid. I mean, the usual hobbies kids have: make models. I played sports. I was big into sports when I was a kid. But I mentioned, I think last time, that my dad was an inveterate tinkerer, right? And one of the things he and I used to like to do was to build stuff and work with tools. And the same was true with, for example, my great uncle, who passed away when I was rather young, but he was the same. He was a builder. He did stuff. So that whole idea, that's not terribly unique. A lot of kids, I mean, particularly back then, were into building plastic models or building stuff, soapbox derby cars and things. And that was fun. That was cool. And it was also a very scientifically rich environment. And I think one of the things that was catalytic, if I look back on it through whatever wisdom I have in my 8 decades of life, if it was a time of real exploration too. I mean, I remember vividly those space launches of the early 1960s. I mean, those folks are my heroes. I mean, the Mercury astronauts. We got these pins that you could wear. You buy them in the store. I mean, it was in the front page of the New York News. John Glenn, Scott Carpenter. This was huge. And then when Gemini went into space, and there were two people, and I remember very, very vividly man landing on the moon, July 20th, 1969. So the idea of being exploratory and investigative, and I mean, this was the same time where Christian Barnard was transplanting the human heart, and they were developing heart-lung machines, and then there were these wonderful explorations, sort of akin to what my father did, to the depths of the ocean in bathyspheres and bathyscapes. There was one very, very deep water submersible called the Trieste. It's the time of Jacques Cousteau. Right? So it was a great time of investigation and exploration. And I think that appealed to me too. I mean, in full confession, not all the decisions I made as a kid were wise, but I was a bit of a wild child when I was a kid. I mean, we were talking just before I came on the air. I was riding a motorcycle when I was 15 years old. I was that kid. I was the kid who did that. And that appealed to me, that idea of kind of hanging out on the edge. I mean, remember, I grew up with Star Trek, to boldly go. Right? Star Trek, Rod Serling, Twilight Zone, of course, Outer Limits, all of these, it was richly science fictional. And all of that science fiction, I think at that time, was highly aspirational science fiction. So that whole thing, I think, created a momentum that lit a fire that now, again, in my 70 years, it's like, wow, it's still, it's, I told my students this, and I'll admit it here. Yeah. There are things about any job where jobs have things that are sort of like, well, it's not the greatest thing in the world. But there's been literally no day that I have gone to work on the civilian side or on the military side where I've not thought, pinch me, this is the best thing I can do and I make money doing this. This is amazing. So I've been very lucky.
And one more question from the childhood before we carry on, and that is, so you've said before, you didn't say just now, but you're Italian background, Italian American, raised in New York. Was your family a religious family? Your aunt, your uncle, your parents? So nobody in your family went to mass. You didn't.
Not well. So it's funny. So on my mom's side, they come from way up north in Italy, a place called the South Tyrol. And that's a sort of religiously heterogeneous population. I mean, it's has a very strong Germanic influence to it. As you know, I mean, the Tyrol. Your listeners may not know about the South Tyrol. It's actually quite beautiful. I mean, it's sort of quasi-alpine, and there are three languages that they speak there. They speak Italian, which is it's a dialectical Italian. They speak German, which is Tyrolean German, and they also speak something called Ladine, which is sort of a derivation of Vulgate Latin. And the reason I say that is that their sort of religious culture is a bit mixed as well. I mean, as you know, Europe, I mean, certainly in the boot of Italy is exceedingly Catholic, but as you get up further north, it's a little more diversified. So, by my education, I went to a Catholic high school because I wanted to play football and wrestle. And then I went to a Jesuit college, St. Peter's College. And of course, I spent 20 years at Georgetown. But if someone to really want to like push me to it and say, all right, I mean, where are you with this? I'm a bit more of a secular agnostic. I don't think, I mean, if you're asking me, what do I believe? I'm happy to tell you. I mean,
Oh
I,
no, no, I was just.
I mean, and I'll be very honest with you. I think the more one learns scientifically, particularly about something as captivating and enigmatic as the brain, I think the more you begin to realize there's a lot there, inclusive of, these sort of predorable existential questions like, well, what is consciousness? Where do we sort of exist with regard to the fabric of the universe? How does this happen? And a lot of the work I deal with is that a very interesting phase, which has now become that area of neural physics. And now there's some renewed talk about quantum processes and connectivity and entanglement. All right. So without going too far down that rabbit hole in this context, I mean, my thought is, I sort of view an individual human brain like a speck of dust on the butt of a flea amongst a gazillion fleas in the sands of the universe. I don't think I'm intelligent enough to know or have any real idea about what makes the universe tick. So if someone were to ask me what my working belief system would be, I'm sort of like a Spinozan, right? I mean, I think that there's some kind of real operative force in the universe. Yeah, I mean, do I think it becomes culturally and even individually important for people to call that something, to name that, and to feel some personal connection with that? I would certainly hope so. Uh, but I was not raised, I mean, we went to church. I had friends next door who were Jewish. I had other friends literally across the street who were Episcopalian, Lutheran. We had Buddhist family two doors down. So my childhood was religiously polyglot. And so, although we sort of went through kind of the formal things, Christmas Eve, you go to midnight mass kind of thing, and celebrated what I would consider to be traditional Abrahamic holidays, Christmas, Easter kind of thing. Uh, my folks were not vivid or diligent, quote, mass goers. And my family was very much religiously open in that regard. So I view myself once again as being very, very fortunate in that there was not necessarily a cloistered view. And I think that was also in some ways pretty instrumental because these sort of long lasting, perdurable, phenomenological, maybe even eschatological questions were not particularly bounded for me as a kid, which I think was very instrumental to sort of learn more, dig, right? So, yeah,
Okay, well, I mean, when I said no, I don't want to know what you believe. I didn't mean to be disingenuous because, of course, I am curious. I am curious because there are a few places, like in your book, Bioethics and Brains, which I read, there was a page there, 78. I wrote, "Who is watching the Watchers?" So it's always interesting to me to know how people think who are in any way in a position to say what is good and what is right and what should you do. I mean, it's interesting to hear where they're coming from. And on the book and also some of the articles that I read that you co-wrote, it wasn't until after I read the book and read the articles, and I'm trying to wrap my head around some questions because I'm going into an area that I'm not familiar with and I'm not educated in. And it wasn't until I looked up John R. Shook and his education and his background and his online presence, some of the things that he's done, including some years back, the God debates, that I said, okay, all right, I can see the position in a way of where these two are coming from in this book. There were words that just got me thinking, like cosmopolitan. What is a cosmopolitan ethic? And so I kind of worked out for myself that a cosmopolitan ethic is one that isn't coming from a moralistic background where you're drawing on morals that you would get from any framework. And frankly, I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. And I know a lot of people might be people get very attached to what they believe.
let me
And
interject, which is
so
another way of saying, let me interrupt, right? Um, True cosmopolitan framework in no way denies or disavows individuals' attachments to what it is they believe. Quite the opposite. It demands respect for that. I mean, we use that term, John Shook and I have used that term in its literal translation, cosmos, politos, right? Cosmopolis, which is all peoples. Right? So being referential and respectful of the fact that people will manifest certain constructs that may be at one point proto-moral, develop into moralities, are then codified by ethics, and then certainly instantiated by various laws. I mean, social laws, cultural laws, even political laws, is exceedingly important. You know, I think if we were talking even as recently as decades ago, one might be able to say, well, this is what we do here, and it stays here. That's what you guys do there, and it stays there. But the ubiquity of contemporary technology has essentially created a diffusion milieu. I mean, we talk about a melting pot. It's not a melting pot. It isn't. It's really more of a stew where the individual ingredients retain their flavor and then that flavor interacts with others that are equally flavorful. And from that comes something that's dialectically synthetic or syncretic, right? At least it should. But again, and our view is not unique. I mean, this is some of the view of Martha Nussbaum and others who talk about standpoint theory. Even some of the work of the philosopher John Rawls, for example, who's talked about the idea, concept, and value of a reflective equilibrium, where part of it is reflective. In other words, what do others believe? What are their values desiderata? What are their norms, standards, mores? Practices, for example, that are based upon and instantiated from their needs. How they define to be good. the moral philosopher, the late Alistair MacIntyre, I mean, to paraphrase one of his more popular books, what good? Who's good? What justice? Whose rationality? A true cosmopolitanism has to allow for that. In other words, it's the old sort of almost kind of quote aboriginal or very native concept of you don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Why? Because it's their shoes. Well, in looking at cosmopolitanism from a neuroethical perspective, I mean, there's something fundamental to that. Let me explain. If you acknowledge the neuro part of a neuroethics, if you consider at least what sometimes referred to as neuroethics first tradition, that is a neuroscientific approach to how it is that humans, and perhaps by extension, other organisms, and now, of course, now we're even thinking things that are in silico, do morality. How is that we morally cognate, come to various moral value systems, engage moral decisions that propel moral actions? We speak in the book, as we do in the book that I did with both John and my European colleague, Roland Benedicter, about neuroscience, neuroethics, and neuroculture, that these things develop a proto-moral sensibility. And the reason for that is that humans are dependent moral animals. And what I mean by that is that we don't do well on our own. We are very, very dependent in ways that compensate for our biological inadequacies and augment certain aspects of our biological capabilities. This is some of the work of the late George Bulliarello, formerly of New York Institute of Technology. I was very fortunate to have an absolutely brilliant graduate student for a while, who's now an equally brilliant rising young academic, Dr. Dan Dagerman. And Dagerman took a concept that was George Bulliarello's, which was called biosoma, which is biology, sociology, and machination. And he embellished on it in a very, very sentinel way. Working with Dan, one of the things that we were instrumental in doing is saying, what humans really do is we have a biology for the majority of our sort of paleoanthropological history. Our biology has not rendered us to be the top of the sort of the apical predator. In fact, our biology sort of rendered us to be prey. The truth of it is we don't run particularly quickly. I don't care how fast somebody like Usain Bolt can sprint. We're not particularly good swimmers, Phelps aside. Still, I mean, he can be outswum by a carp. Even the fastest human can be outrun by a house cat or a dog. We're not terribly good climbers. Oh, yeah, we've ascended Everest, but realistically, our primate forebears put us to shame. We can't see infrared or ultraviolet. We don't have the hearing capacity that allows us to go ultrasonically or subsonically. We don't have huge fangs and canine teeth, right? We don't have tremendously powerful jaws. But what we do have is perhaps upright posture, opposable thumbs, that we have a brain. And the question then becomes, well, did the human brain develop as a consequence of our need for dependent interaction, for mutuality and compensation for our biological insufficiencies, gapping, for example? Or was that how those things developed? Chicken, egg. The bottom line is that we are dependent animals. And part of that is, how do we interact with those who we have social interactions with? Initially proximate family, then extended family, then little friends, then school, then work, then culture at large, environment at large. So the questions are, how do we fit? How do we fit well? How do we interact with others so we can get our needs met and also recognize that there are going to be contingencies and quid pro quo interactions? That's proto-morality. To circle that back to why that is important for a cosmopolitan approach, the reason for that is, in essence, if one looks at consciousness as the product of what a brain does, all of consciousness is subjective. So what it really tells you is that the only thing that I can positively, absolutely know by my first person experience is that which is my subjectivity. Mm-hmm. And everyone has that. Everyone brings their own life experiences that have in some way formed even the structural architectures of that brain, and certainly its patterns of functional connectivity and operation. And that then creates particular predispositions, biases. And those things are manifest by one's immediate or proximate social milieu and expanding circles. We can't know that objectively. we can only then perceive that through our subjective interaction or what objective facts are then enacted. So it becomes important to understand that standpoint theory, that perspectival orientation that individuals and collectives bring because of the nature of how their brain minds operate, particularly with regard to a neuroethics. How is it that the neuroscience of morality and ethics can inform the ethics of neuroscience and its applications, and vice versa? So for John Shook and I, for Rolly Benedictor and I, and for our colleagues, and there have been many, that perspective, I think, opens up the lens quite a bit, and at least establishes the importance, if not the need, for that type of standpoint appreciation, which, again, I think is attributable and exercisable, not just within neuroscience or the sciences, but very broadly in any application of neural and cognitive sciences to human interaction, interculturally, intercollectively, and even idiosyncratically.
When we spoke first, I said sincerely, but maybe flippantly, I don't know anything about ethics. And so I looked into it and I realized, well, sure you do, because I've been going through my whole life saying what is good and what is right. Therefore, I have strived to live an ethical life without really thinking about what I'm doing. But I think, I said that my foray into it was reading the Thomas Huxley and Julian Huxley lectures on ethics and evolution. And one thing that stood out again, boiling it down to the absolute essence for me, is who's watching the watchers, because this is pages, hundreds of pages of their lecture on ethics and evolution. And there was a point where Julian Huxley said, we, and he means we, an educated and informed and academic we, who have applied ourselves to this, need to help the ethics evolve. So again, I'm writing in the margin, who's watching the watchers? Because if you have something, so for me, it's an easy question or an easy answer to the question, what is good? I can decide in that moment, what is good, what is right.
What is your answer to who's watching the watchers?
Well, I thought about that last night, and my answer was, well, why not me?
Why not you?
Yeah, why not me? So
I mean, so let me throw something out there that I think is very important. Again, not to harken back to in the book I did with John Shook, but it is a new book, and my thought is it's gotten some good traction. But one of the things that I'd like to be able to sort of direct the potential reader or even the prior reader to or back to, respectively, is we talk about what we call four second order sets of principles. I mean, one might look to the biomedical ethical principles that have been advocated by the late Tom Beecham and James Childress, the idea of wanting to do good, benevolence, and doing good, beneficence, the idea of avoiding harm, non-malevolence, and actually not harming, non-maleficence, respect for individual and collective autonomy of individuals to be making their own free choices and doing so with their own determination, and then some sense of justice. In other words, how do we allocate various goods and benefits across those who need them with some level of, or some calculus of proportionality? Those are great. Those are great principles. And of course, they comport well with a whole host of other systems: duties, utility, virtue, community, cosmopolitanism, even various forms of theological and or religious ethics. The problem is that they're mid-level ethics. That's also their benefit. In other words, they can be tacked on to any underlying philosophy. On one hand, that's very useful. On the other hand, it can be problematic because those principles, even if something, how do you order them? What comes first? What's the primary principle, so to speak? Might differ based upon what the philosophical orientation is. So this is what we call prima facie principles. In other words, at first view, yeah, they're great. Nobody's going to argue. Benevolence, beneficence, great. Do good. Non-maleficence, non-malevolence, don't harm, don't want to harm, great. Do that. Respect people for autonomous, absolutely. Which one comes first? right? And sometimes that can create tension between those principles and even conflict, particularly if they're ascribed to different underlying philosophical, moral, or ethical precepts, sort of what are sometimes known as normativities, normative ethics. That's great, but we're not going to deny that, and we didn't really want to go deeply into that, what I would call very sort of philosophically ethical discussion. But let's take a look at what we think is going to be important, not only for neuroscience and neuroethics, but we postured it to be a little more broader in its aperture, perhaps any scientific or technological ethics. So, building above that, what we were looking at is the idea of self empowerment as a principle. And we do this all the time. We utilize our knowledge, we utilize our tools to empower ourselves. We're doing it right now. We're at a distance. I can't have this conversation with you sitting over a cup of coffee in your salon, and vice versa. Yet we're empowered to do this. We're empowered to talk at this level through these tools. We do it all the time. Self-creativity. Sure. I mean, we use our knowledge. We use the tools to get that knowledge. We use the knowledge to build new tools, to be creative in terms of what it is I want to be and become. What some of the German philosophers, inclusive of sort of the pre-1930s Martin Heidegger, and then again after the sort of post-technologic turn, referred to as Selbstbestätigen. In other words, to define yourself, your own standing, right? Not only I am, like ich bin, I am, but ich werde, I'm becoming. What do I want to become, right? Right. All right. But, to do that, to do those two things, we also want to make sure that science and that technology doesn't render us obsolete. And our ability to be empowered and our ability to be creative should not render others to be obsolete. A very, as you know, pertinent discussion right now with AI. Is AI, is this thing that we have created actually some kind of golem that is now going to render whole dimensions of our occupational or avocational or daily lives relatively obsolete, right? And we've been there before. I mean, certainly we've seen this before with other technologies. The motor carriage rendering the entire sort of equine industry obsolete, who was a carriager, who was a farrier and horseshoer, etc. Okay. We've certainly seen this with storytellers and the printing press. So again, if we look at some of the great work of the philosopher and cognitive scientist and historian Merlin Donald, he looks at the evolution of human cognition and some of the changes. And this refers back to some of the work of a really esteemed colleague of mine named Mr. Pat Scannell, who has an excellent new book coming out with De Gruyter Press that I really recommend highly. Pat Scannell. Keep that name in the forefront. He's an up and coming big star, I think. But again, for Shook and I, and also for some extent to Rolly Benedictor and I, it's not just can I be creative or can I be empowered, but what about obsolescence? I shouldn't render others obsolete through my own strivings of creativity and empowerment, both idiosyncratically and collectively. So how do you do this? Well, the fourth principle that we add to this is something called citizenry. And here's where it intersects with cosmopolitanism. In contemporary society, given what technology has done to break down barriers and make ourselves, both individually and our collectives, relatively transparent or at least communicative, what am I a citizen of? One could certainly say I'm a speciesist citizen. I am a citizen of my species. But that very same knowledge, for example, of the brain sciences, makes us recognize that perhaps species is not different kinds, but different types and extensive things. For example, different types of consciousness, different types of sensing, feeling, perceiving. This is some of the work, for example, of Richard Ryder. This is some of the work of, in my group, Sherry Lovelace and I. So, to what is our citizenship? To what are those loyalties? I'm not going to deny for a moment that there are proximate loyalties that we know anthropologically for kin and kith. This has been what I call the Patricia and Paul Churchland argument. Absolutely right. But given the contemporaneity of what our tools have allowed with regard to our communication and perhaps our insight to others on a variety of levels, from the neurobiologic to the psychosocial, from the cellular all the way up to the social, from the individual to the international. What John Shook and Rolly Benedictor and I are getting at, and to some extent, another colleague of ours, Dr. Karen Herrera Ferra, who does an awful lot of work with neuro rights, for example, is that our citizenry needs to be recalibrated in terms of what it means to be global. And of course, John and I have written quite a bit about the globality of not only neuroethics, but science and technological ethics writ large, given the way science and technology can be leveraged for relative goods. Who are they relative to? Now we go back to Alistair McIntyre's question, but also the idea of developing particular asymmetries and what that then means. And now we hearken into some of the work of the existential French philosopher Michel Foucault that deals with biopower and when it's yielded by states or peoples, biopolitics. So that's where that cosmopolitan argument really comes to the fore in terms of being able to gain insight and perhaps from that insight judgment towards a more inclusive and standpoint relevant perspective.
My late husband, his name was Alan Watt. He was not the English Zen Buddhist entertainer philosopher, but Alan Watt.
I was almost like, wow.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Not to de-wow your late husband, but I was like, come on, you didn't come clean with me. All right.
no, yeah, no. My husband was also wow. He was an amazing thinker and historian who was not an academic, but he had studied history back into antiquity, and he was. I forced one of my cousins to listen to a talk after he passed away, and I was returned home, and she listened to a few minutes of it, and she said, "Oh, so he's a philosopher, or he was a philosopher." But at any rate, he wrote a book in 1999 that was entitled The Androgynous Hermaphroditic Agenda. And on page 5 of that book, he wrote a sentence, one line, short line, that said, "This is the final phase of humanity as we know it." Now, what struck me, especially rereading it after he passed away, what struck me was that he didn't qualify that remark. He didn't say, unless we, if we don't, no, he said it. This is the final phase of humanity as we know it. I was listening a couple of days ago to, I think his name, is it David Eagleman? So David Eagleman was speaking with someone, and he said, in the very near future, humans will be less like what we were, like, say, 50 years from now or 100 years from now. We will be more different as to what we call humans than going back 5,000 years or into what you might call Neanderthal. There's going to be that much of a change. And so before we talk about that, another one from my late husband. People would call him, they would email, and they would say, "I just have one question. I just have a quick question." And he would say to me, "Well, for that quick question, for me to answer that quick question, they would need to read these 100 books. They would need to do a master class that might take a decade, in other words, to answer that question." And I amused myself in thinking about that when I got to the end of our conversation last time, and I was looking through the notes, and it's like, where did we leave off there? Well, so I said, next time we're going to talk about is humanity coming to an end, transhumanism, posthumanism. And then I thought to myself, what does it mean to be a human? So this is the question. What does it mean to be a human? And I realized that in order for me to answer that question to my own satisfaction, it required a massive amount of thinking and seeing what do other people say a human is. This got me into the hard question of consciousness. It took me into the mind-body problem, and certain philosophers that I've read years ago, just out of curiosity, what do they say a human is? What is consciousness? How does this question, which evidently is many, many thousands of years old, how does this affect where we are going? But I think it's clear to me when I read your book, when I listen to anyone talk, and that's why I like to not come from the place of what should be, but what is. What is going on right now? Because I am always inclined to see things through the lens of my late husband. And I would agree, this is the final phase of humanity as we know it now.
Yeah, let me think that's very prescient and very profound. Um, but I also think it can be contextualized. Let me explain. I think there have been a number of epochs throughout human history where humans of that time could look around and say, I think this is the final phase of humans as we know it now. And I think the now is the crucial point of that. I mean, I think the idea of recognizing that humanity writ large might be at an inflection point, a pivoting point, such that it is revolutionary, not just evolutionary. Let me explain that difference. Evolution can involve a number of different particular processes. One can get gradual or what's known as stepwise evolution, and then there's this thing also referred to as sort of rapidly punctuated or quantum evolution. But very often what happens is when you get to some evolutionary threshold, crossing that threshold is revolutionary as well. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Revolutionary literally meaning you've gone from this to this. And you can't go backwards. You've revolved into something else where now this becomes sort of the forward face, and this is always what you were behind you. Is it possible to de-revolve? Yeah, it is. But here too, characteristically, that de-revolution, that undoing, is exactly that. It's a tremendous undoing that in some ways can be very destructive. And I think there's debate. I mean, there's dialectic. What is good, what is not? Have we come to a revolutionary point which is not necessarily beneficial? Benefit is always through the eye of those who are viewing it. Fine. But I think your late husband's point was sentinel. In many ways, he's supporting and being supported by some of the work, again, of a philosopher called Merlin Donald, who refers to, again, epochs of human cognitive evolution. And this one really represents the technological turn. And it's not just a question that we're relying upon technology in our cognition. I think that's inarguable. One could go to the point of the printing press, literally go back to Gutenberg forward, and say, that was the starting point of this thing that may have begun some inertial process toward momentum. Okay. But I think a very transitional element of that, both in terms of its pace as well as its profundity, scale, have been the computational sciences, inclusive of the way we use data for information and information for knowledge, and not just the dependency upon that, but the interactivity, the reciprocity of human and machine. And rather than thinking of a single physical machine, one has to think of artificial intelligence writ large as a system of systems. Internet of things, internet of the internet. And here I think you see two intersecting things. You see, again, I hearken back to my very astute graduate student, Dan Dagerman, who took a look at the idea of the transhuman, literally, the human in transition, which, let's face it, is axiomatic to human history. We're tool users, and we use those tools both to develop our theories, then our theories dance back to inform how we could use those tools, and then ultimately we diversify those tools to a set of tasks, encounter new tasks because we come to the limits and or extents of our theories, and then develop tools anew. This very interesting sort of tool, theory, task, triumvirate dance, right? Where no one leads. It isn't necessarily one leading the other. It is in many ways, I think, dynamically interactive. But one of the things that Dagerman and I were very interested in is, well, what does that mean to be the human in transition? Hmm? And it is biopsychosocial, where each one of those is then affected by the tools within those domains and between those domains. But what's happened is the human in transition has also created something that may in fact be an informational form that is taking on qualities that allows it to exercise particular characteristics, character, capabilities that are at least equivalent to our own, and maybe in some cases surpass, at least in certain domains and dimensions, to which we are becoming increasingly reliant. And that is the whole sort of cyber technological AI thing. The question then arises is, to what extent might AI be the post-human? And what does that mean with regard to humanity? And I think more nihilistic views will sort of say, oh, it's the rise of machines, these sort of Terminator scenarios. But I think your husband and others may be right. There have been other times during human evolutionary history, paleontologically, anthropologically, where we've had to share our place on the proverbial totem pole of apical species with others. It's been a long time since we've done that. I mean, we can even look back to our own hominid history and recognize that there were hominid species that were coexistent. You alluded earlier to the Neanderthals, and I mean, certainly we see that there was a dynamical interaction between Neanderthal species, Cro-Magnon, and other hominid species. And that wasn't just a question of Neanderthals fell out, but what was happening as a consequence of interbreeding, hybridization, etc. What is a hybrid? What might even be some type of a mild chimera? And what does that then mean for us now? Are we seeing more hybridization, for example, the human machine interface? And at what point does that then reach what my colleague Paolo Benanti in Rome refers to as cyborg not as entity, but cyborg as process? Where that fifth level of cyborgization is the inextricability of things that are machine oriented and or technical with the biology of the human. And where does that biology separate? One of the things that we're working on now, that I'm working on again with John Shook, but also with a very, very bright young fellow who's working with our group, whose name is Dr. Elise Annette, is what's happening with iteratively autonomous agentic artificial information. And I allude back here to some of the work we're doing with Pat Scannell, particularly when those systems become what's called biomimetic. In other words, where either we are developing and creating those systems to mimic aspects of organismal biology, not necessarily even our own. And as a consequence of that, they're becoming more neuro-like, what our group refers to as neuromimesis. In some cases, it's analogous. In other words, these systems are working like neural systems do. But in other cases, they're almost becoming homologous, or at least what we call quasi-homologous. You may not necessarily have nerve cells, organic nerve cells, but you certainly have units, systems, that are functioning like nerve cells do. And in some cases, there may even be the direct interaction of that technical aspect of the system with organic, with the interaction of what may be sometimes referred to as silicon systems with organic systems or carbon-based systems. Okay. So what is that? So have we created, or are we seeing, the true rise of a post-human entity? And then the question becomes, what does that post-human entity portend for our definition of biology? Bios, life, logos, rational accounting. And is this thing in some way a person, according to classical antiquarian definition, This, for example, is the Professor White argument from Loyola Marymount University on the West Coast. Wonderful book called In Defense of Dolphins that looks at dolphins and asks the question, do they person? Do they have those characteristics? And I think on some level the answer is yes. And if we're a little less hubristic and a little less anthropocentric, not anthropomorphic, anthropocentric, I think we recognize that some of those characteristics that we thought were uniquely our own are in fact enacted, engaged, embodied by other species as well. Not necessarily identically, and there's no reason for it to be identical. It doesn't necessarily do away with the fact that we have a unique consciousness, but it certainly doesn't negate the fact that these other things may be sentinel consciousness, whatever. Nor does it, I think, dispel the fact that they may be able to exercise characteristics, domains, qualities of persons. And then what is the threshold for that? Is this a binary threshold? Or is this more of a fuzzy set where certain characteristics and domains can be differentially weighted in sort of an if-then, then yes. I tend to lean towards the latter. But I think what this also infers is, well, what does it mean to be alive? We can start the discussion to say, well, is it sentient, conscious, or not? Perhaps we will not know. Just as your listeners and your viewers may be looking at me and wondering, well, is he conscious or not? Me. Let's face it, you have no idea. For all you know, I could be something the Department of War, Department of Defense created. They put quarters in somewhere, pulled a string, and here I am. We stop this, boom, I shut off like a light bulb. So I've passed some kind of quasi-Turing test, and you think, oh, that was fun. I'm just a machine. I'm a talking head. I'm max headroom. You don't know that. More than that, you have no idea what it feels like to be me, to experience the world through my embodied consciousness. This is what the philosopher Thomas Nagel refers to as a mortal question. He asks the question, what's it like to be a bat? You have no idea what it's like to be a bat or a whale or a neonate. I don't. Just like you have no idea what it's like to be me. The only thing you can do is compare me to your subjective phenomenological experience. So given that, the question then becomes, we may not know really in the first person reality of whether or not an AI system is conscious. Just as, again, as my colleague Joseph Fins has argued, covert consciousness exists in humans and continues to be a problem for medical assessment of those who are non-communicative, obtunded, vegetative. And now we're trying to use various forms of neurotechnology to assess our patterns of objectifiable neurological information, strong reflectivities, responses that are tokens of what we might be able to say consciousness is there based upon this pattern. But we can't know unless you ask. You're still matching pattern to pattern, and there's some level of tokenism, right? Same is true for AI. If it tells you I'm conscious, do you believe it? Are there tests? Are there sort of iterative quasi-Turing tests that we may be able to develop? Perhaps. Will they have some utility? Yeah, perhaps. But the other question is, well, is there something else to that? I mean, no one's going to deny the fact that there are animals that we give credit to being alive to that for centuries, if not millennia, we said were not conscious. Is there a mutual exclusivity? Oh yeah, AI is not conscious because we can't know that objectively, and therefore why should we fall into that trap? But is it somehow alive? Does it meet enough of those criteria at this point or in the near future where you go, ooh, it is self-sustainable, it is reproducible, it seeks to maintain its own continuity and survivability. Uh-oh. So even if not all of the criteria are there, but some, are we seeing the rise of something that we have created, at least partly in our own image, to think the way we do, but now comes after us, with a set of characteristics that are similar yet different in many ways, but that may force us to appreciate as a post-human entity that occupies some space in that apical area of where we are in the large chain of biological living organisms that exist on the planet. And as I said, it's been a while since we've had to confront that. So I think it's provocative. I think it's contentious. But I think it's also something we need to think about.
Well, like I said, I'll just drive myself right over here to this place near the end when we were speaking before, and a couple of notes that I had written. You co-wrote an article. This might have been with John R. Shook or maybe somebody else. Spirituality, an overlooked predictor of placebo effects.
No, no, it's with Dr. Nico Coles, my very, very good
Okay.
friend and colleague, Professor Nico Coles from Coburg University and formerly of the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich.
Okay. All right. Great. Sorry that I didn't know that, but I made a note there that after reading it, I thought of Persinger's God helmet. That Yeah, because in other words, you can create that effect in someone. You can create that. You can tap into that place in the brain that is that God. That's what Persinger was doing. That's what he was
Yes,
attempting to do.
yes, and no. This is also some of the great work of Dr. Andrew Newberg. And for a while, Persinger and Newberg had done some collaborative work, although it was sort of distantly collaborative. It wasn't necessarily working together; it was certainly working in support. This is not to say that there is like a God nucleus, right? A nucleus deus somewhere in the brain. I stimulate that thing, boom. But as Nico Coles and I have said in that paper, and some others, we also talk about the relationship, for example, of spirituality processes and those experiences with regard to embodiment and pain and so forth. And I think that that's a useful discourse. An older paper that I did with another colleague of mine, Dr. Joan Engebretsen, back in 2005 or 2006, was looking at sort of the neurocognitive and basis of what might be spiritual experiences and practices, right? As sort of invocational practices that have multiple values that are not only biological values, but then also translate into our cognitive experiences. And then that feeling of what happens is what Antonio Damasio refers to as the cognitive basis of our emotion, or vice versa, the emotional basis that engages our cognition. But I think you need to take in a broader view. Nico and I sort of taken into a larger raking, and in part, some of it is in that paper. There's another paper that we did that it occurred in the journal. Is it Brain and Mind, or Mind and Brain, or I forgot what journal it was years ago. That's the problem is you write a lot with your friends and your colleagues, and there's like, okay, what journal was that? And it sort of looks at that whole nature of what are these types of experiences and how they may sort of fold into a larger, more complete and more granular picture. There isn't a God nucleus. There isn't even sort of a tractus religicus in the brain, so to speak. Right? But I think what many of these practices and experiences have in common is that they engage patterns, probably very discernible, relatively distinct and identifiable patterns of neurological node and network activity that have phenomenological, realistic qualities to them. A sense of disembodiment, a sense of greater alignment, a depth, for example, of vision, found reflectivity, different level of interpersonal and perhaps even organismal relatedness. In other words, suddenly feeling a more, quote, oneness, right? And we can plot and track some of these patterns in the functioning brain utilizing various forms of neuroimaging. And there are many different types. Certainly, I think the best types that we can use to do that are the ones that will literally trace, called tractographies, coupled with some of the very advanced forms of magneto and quantitative encephalography that are looking at the electrical signals as well. And I think what you're really seeing is that there are patterns of brain activity that will provide for that person a very rich phenomenological first-person experience of stuff. Then the question is, how does one relate that to what is going to be the inductive elements of that experience? Are there things that one can do They're practices that create that physiological predispositional state that then is more amenable to that induction. Prayer, chant, dance, meditation. And of course, we've also looked at if, in fact, some of those states can be induced pharmacologically, for example, through the use of various psychotropic drugs, inclusive of the psychedelic drugs, such as lysergic acid diethylamide, psilocybin, and of course, the one that's probably gotten the most attention is dimethyltryptamine, DMT, sometimes referred to as the God molecule. And I think if one actually takes a look at what the mechanisms are across individuals, across groups, and then breaks those things down statistically into individual to group and group to individual comparisons, there are going to be some common substrates, number one. We've also looked at the capability of various forms of emerging neurotechnologies, transcranial magnetic and electrical stimulation, or perhaps even indwelling stimulatory forms, to create those patterns of brain activity. So what you're seeing is the use of not only practices, but perhaps substances and now technologies to be, fancy word, entheogenic. In other words, to create something of a spiritual phenomenological experience in that person who's going through it. And then what might be the relative value or even maybe the relative vice of that? Right? So I think that the take home message here is that human brains, certainly, and I'd go so far as to say perhaps other brains that can cognate like this, have the capacity to engage experiences and have the first person subjective phenomenological reality of that experience that can be very much expansive, grounding, allow some level of feeling detached from one's body and externality. And I think there is the potential, there is literally the neurocognitive potential for one to then have these types of experiences that can only be described as, quote, exceptional, to use the words of my colleague Nico Coles, and that take on a very spiritual denotation, connotation, and in some cases, phenomenological reality. Now, what does that mean? Right now you go back to your other question. Well, what is consciousness and what's happening there? Good luck. Now we've just opened that jar, Pandora. Let's go for it. Is it possible, for example, and this is something you and I spoke about last time, that what you're really doing is you're changing the pattern of neurological activity in that brain to be able to now switch into a new antenna mode, a new capture mode, a new entangled mode, or even just change the parameters of the box, or perhaps just change the function of the generator where now you're generating something else. And is that actually a higher order, perhaps, of not just experience, but actually a higher order of function that conjoins now what would be the conscious experience of that with processes that, without those particular mechanisms or inductions, exist in the preconscious, unconscious, deep subconscious. So again, what the fascinating, the fun part is, here are these patterns, here are these qualities. What might they mean?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the answer for that, but I think it's a hell of a good question.
There was another paper that I read that you co-wrote, The Future of the Self-Image. Now, this is important because you get it, you've already touched on it here, self-creativity. And self-creativity, I mean, let's start with body modification. You can tattoo, you can pierce an ear, you can, so self-creativity, in a way, the sky's the limit, and we've been doing it since time immemorial, right? So, but here's your title, The Future of the Self-Image of the Human Being in the Age of Transhumanism, Neurotechnology, and Global Transition. I think this was written in 2010.
Slowly, Benedictor.
Okay, so before I get to my questions from that, or it's really a summary. They're your own questions. They were the questions that you and Benedictor were asking. But before I get there, I'll just take something out of this title, The Future of the Self-Image. So in my crash course thinking. Like I asked the question, to myself and to you last time, well, what does it mean to be a human? And I realized, well, boy, there's a lot of work that I might want to do to answer that question. So I'm looking at John Locke and David Hume. And John Locke is saying there's a continuous, and Locke's basic thesis regarding consciousness is you are conscious because there's a line of memory. There are your memories that you can say, that is me, and you can take it all the way back. And Hume is saying no, that's almost like a Buddhist in a way. If you get to his concept of self, that there may not be an actual experiencer that can look back on that and reflect it. And I thought, well, gosh, I never actually thought about that question as simple as that. What is my self-image? And how did I arrive at that self-image? Because for me, I just am. I've always just been I am. So I've never had to justify my humanity. If somebody said, are you a human? I'd say, of course. Are you conscious? Surely. But then but for people who are creating ethics, which then go into law, each one of these questions that I take for granted has multiple meanings. And once I dig in and look at who is defining what it means to be a human, what it means to be conscious, I realize it's an absolute stew.
Well, look, I mean, and again, we've been confronted with this repeatedly throughout human history. Right? I think the potential distinction now, and what Rolly, Benedicta, and I were doing, is we were taking this from sort of we were building upon a historical lens. In other words, the phenomenon of the human image, right, has been something that has been discussed and debated throughout much of human history. Right? And there's a lot of tags that go onto that. In other words, by what criteria is this image being preserved and or denigrated? One could look back extensively through history. In other words, early explorers came across a group of people, and at some point or another they said these people are not even human. They're savages. Right? Okay, but wait. Why? Very often what ends up happening is distinction, ignorance, failure to be able to relate, fear, disgust, power. All can play into this. Once again, this goes back to some of the work of Foucault, biopower. How do we align that? How do I take a look at certain things that may vulnerabilize you and then volatilize that in ways that create asymmetries? All right. If we look to contemporary history, far more contemporary history, one doesn't have to look internationally. One can look to American history and recognize that some of the abrogations of slavery were all predicated upon distinctions as to what represents humanity and doesn't, or what kinds of humanity counts. I mean, the mere fact that the idea of the pseudo-pathology called drapetomania existed on the books as law, as a pseudo-medical condition by which law was predicated in the United States until the 20th century, I think is testimonial to the fact that human image is something that can be very subjective and very often rests upon those in power who are making that definition of what that image is. We could look again to Europe. I mean, one could take a look, for example, at something called the Nürnberger Gesetz, which is the Nuremberg laws, which essentially looked at Jewish people in Germany as not being of value, of not having characteristics that rendered them at the same level of humanity, and therefore that human image was, these are, the word were Untermenschen, subhuman. And of course, I mean, this was paramount to then the development of those programs, not only then obviously leveraged against Jewish people, Roma, Slavs, etc. But we can go back to something that was pre-Hitlerite. We can go back to something that arose from the early part of the 20th century. Again, even before the idea of ideal humans
Hmm. Hmm.
based upon a concept of what would be ideal, and this is eugenics, which is not inherently evil or deleterious. It's a striving to create something which is good, but that can become easily bastardized and corrupted, as so many things can. But then if you go one step further, it's, well, who may be even experiencing what I'm capable of experiencing? What other types of things that look enough like me simply don't have the neurocognitive consciousness, experiential phenomenological horsepower to even appreciate the beauty and value of life? Oh, these are lives unworthy of even existing because of the paucity of their experiences and the
Right.
profundity of burden, not only that they go through every day because they suffer, they can't possibly appreciate what it's like to be human. But then, of course, we, whoever we are burdened with taking care of this. This was the premise of the whole sort of the Überdefinition des Lebens und Wertes Leben, the, the sort of the sort of recalcitrance, the removal of the destruction of lives unworthy of life. This was not a National Socialist document. This was written by a jurist and a physician during the Weimar period in Germany in the 1920s. And the idea there was, well, we can't even count these individuals as human. Of course, that was then uptaken and corrupted within the whole Hitlerzeit, the whole Nazi time. But the two authors were Hoch and Binding, were approaching this in sort of a form of almost social Darwinism with a bastardized kind of appreciation of what is the real human and what doesn't constitute humanity.
Hmm.
As I've said in many of my lectures, we have to be exceedingly careful of how we use the knowledge and the tools we have, and how we leverage and or use or misuse the knowledge and the tools we don't. So what Rowley and I were essentially looking at, and again, this is a paper that was written the better part of 16 years ago, was how poised we stand on this cusp, given these technologies in convergence that allow us to assess, access, and affect the human embodied brain mind in its embeddedness in our ecologies and cultures, and what interpretations, what meanings, what values are assigned or derived therefrom. And what does this also mean with regard to the way we're using technology and appreciating technology in reciprocity? What does it mean to be human? Again, this is not something that was uniquely our own. I mean, this is something that Fukuyama has talked about, Frank Fukuyama. Certainly something that Chris Hablez-Gray has talked about with regard to sort of the cyborg prophecies. And I think this is even richly woven through much of the work of the biologist and philosopher Donna Haraway, and not only in her concept of sort of the philosophical posthuman, but in the way that she sort of views that trend towards technologization and the if you will, the intermerging, the interbreeding of technology as product and technology as purpose with humanity.
Well, I mean, one doesn't really need to have, or operators don't need to have advanced technology or tools in order to dehumanize. You just have to look at propaganda. I mean, the bad Hun, or let's bomb them into the Stone Age where they belong. I mean, propaganda dehumanizes. So we don't have to wait to have a technology to be afraid of or an AI to be afraid of to be dehumanized. But
I think so, but I think there's a couple of different things going on. I mean, I think certainly, as you say, if we look at even the history of what has become known as propaganda, not just in modern history. I mean, certainly we can look at the 20th century as being rife with that. Yes, absolutely. Probably the tip of that spear was the nature of the propaganda that was promulgated by, for example, Joseph Goebbels during the Third Reich period against not only Jews, but against Slavs, degenerate art, etc. But again, I mean, we can take a look at even cartoons in the United States during the 1940s and 50s with regard to depiction of individuals who were Asian, blacks, Native Americans. The idea of Native Americans as the ignoble savage. So, what tends to happen is these attempts to dehumanize can be exceedingly useful because what they allow individuals and groups to do is to distort some level of pathos, whether it's sympathy, empathy, compassion, because this thing is not me. It doesn't feel what I feel. It doesn't have the drives that I feel. It doesn't have the passions that I feel, the fears that I have. But worse than that, it threatens me. Its existence is a threat to my kin and my kith, and therefore, what is the good? This must be eradicated. And let me not manifest any guilt or let me not manifest any burden in so doing because this thing is not me. It is not even human.
Mhm.
And in fact, it will corrupt my humanity if
Mhm.
it persists. So that idea, I mean, this is something that I had written about in a Pentagon paper a few years ago called Evil in Every Man. I think can be exceedingly potent with regard to various narratives, stories that contain those narratives, images, iconographies, semiotics, many of them subliminal, that have gone into not only propaganda, but what is sometimes referred to as information operations, psychological operations. And in fact, now we're beginning to see this in a larger perspective in what is being considered to be cognitive warfare. And of course, one of the main elements in cognitive warfare is the ability to use some of these computational tools like machine learning and AI to create non veridical images, depictions that look fully real and yet represent something quite differently, that are able to communicate what is apparent as a reality, but in truth is non veridical for influence
Mhm.
operations, for disruptive operations, to be able to change hearts by affecting minds. Right? So again, not to say that Rowley and I were prescient or in any way sort of clairvoyant 16 years ago, but I think what we based that paper on about 2.5 years of work that we had done together since Rowley and I were literally physically working together. He was a fellow with me at Georgetown that was surveying the way technology has been used, is being used, and then we did trend analysis and then looked at sort of the socio-anthropologic implications of those trends, not just within a unitary culture, for example, of the West, but globally, because globalization as a trend was reciprocally and complementarily reinforcing of some of those trajectories.
In the Aroli Benedictor article from 16 years ago, you said, "What conclusions can we draw from our reflections? First, we believe that a global mindset change is occurring at the interface between technology and society. Second, this change is based, at least in part, upon attempts to redefine the essence of the human being. Third, this redefinition of the human being constitutes the end of traditional humanism as we know it. And fourth, the three aforementioned monisms compete with each other, but this tension has not been wholly productive to date." Now, there was a place in the book where you kind of got into the second and third points there with John Shook. This redefinition of the human being constitutes the end of traditional humanism. And when I've got it so marked up, I started getting rid of marks so that I could find it, and I couldn't find that point where you and John Shook were discussing the end of humanism or traditional humanism. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. Pull out a couple of things there. Can you elaborate on how do you redefine the essence of the human being, and how does that redefinition change what we call traditional humanism?
I think that what we're really bringing to the fore is not necessarily that there's an absolute change. In other words, it's going from A to B, but we're bringing into stark relief the nature of that process. Right? Take, for example, the things that we're able to do with human thought. Again, this is some of the work I refer back to a colleague of mine called named Pat Scannell, who talks about that idea. I mean, the whole idea of the end of thought or the change of human thought, drawing very heavily, but then expanding, I think, profoundly on the work of Merlin Donald, who we talked about here. I think as we become more technologically both reliant, interactively reliant, but also more dependent. I mean, clearly more dependent. And that's not a bad thing. It isn't. I mean, let's face it. Humans are tool users. Other species are as well, but we're at the top of that ziggurat. And we've capitalized on that tool use across all the entities of our existence, our biological, our psychological, our social, and then everything that goes along with that social writ large, our ecological, environmental, etc., even the temporal. We use tools. We use tools to tell time. We use tools to change things across time, bring things from the past into the present reality visually, tactily, experientially. We allow our technologies to depict in frank reality, right? Or visual reality, experiential reality, our future, movies, right? I mean, something as simple as the printing press is allowed the great work of H.G. Wells, right? So again, that may seem almost trite, but let's take it for what it's actually doing. I mean, human brains are time machines. We reach into our past and we extend into our future. We use our tools to augment that. It's been there. That's how we work. We relate our past to the present, match it to sample, make some decisions about what our actions can and should be, do that, and wait for those consequences to reinforce or negate what our prior dispositions may be. Everything works that way. Okay. Our tools are nothing more than augmentative to that process. What, for example, the fighter pilot and Air Force intelligence operator, his name is John Boyd, called the OODA loop. Observations, orientations, decisions, and actions, which my colleague Diane DeUlis and I have embellished a bit upon to call the DUDAC loop. Dispositions that we learn through our life that influence what we observe, how we orient to those observations, our decisions, our actions, and ultimately the consequences of those actions, short, intermediate, and long term, that feed back and either reinforce and fortify those dispositions and biases, or become dissonant with them and may either prompt us to change or prompt us to abreact, depending. But I think what we see is the concept of the human, not just as tool user, but as that which is becoming increasingly engaged with and perhaps part of the tools themselves, is one element. The concept of traditional humanism, based upon the assumption that humans are the center of all things, right? I'm not going to deny that the kernel of that precept continues to exist. But I think that it also becomes necessary to say, well, what are humans creating and how do our creations then influence, A, what may be our self-perceived primacy as the center of all things, B, how we relate to each other. In other words, what I'll call relational humanism and what that means. And also the idea of humanism in terms of humanism as a form of extensible secularism versus religiosity. And what that may also then mean for those appreciations of where sort of the humanist mindset exists with regard to our place in that. So without going too far down the rabbit hole, I think what we were alluding to and continue to allude to, although John Shook and I in Bioethics and Brains certainly touch on it, we touch on it much more in the book recently published by Springer. This is a self-promotional plug, by the way. Again, that's the Neuroscience, Neuroethics, and Neuroculture book with John Shook and Rowley, where we really get into that on the cultural level. Culture here with a little c. In other words, culture literally as a forum for development and as parameters of expression. Think of culture like a petri dish. Right?
Mhm.
Things grow in it. And then there's also the establishment of where they can grow over the edge of that culture. So, what are we encultured for? What are we enculturing? How is it that neuroscience and how we view right, wrong, good, bad, not only about the science, but how the science allows us to view our conceptualizations of that, are affected by our culture and affect culture in all of its different levels and domains?
Well, thank you. Yes, that answers my question. Now, we're coming up on your time window. I appreciate it, and I don't want to abuse it because I think there will need to be a part three.
Great joy. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You had a suggestion for a title, and it was this: Brain Games, the Barter and Battle for the Mind. And we were going to discuss neuroweapons and cognitive enhancement. We have not gotten to cognitive enhancement. And I was thinking about that, but I realized I don't want to get to cognitive enhancement until I hash out a little bit of the ethics and what it means to be a human, because why start talking about what's available now as an enhancement if we don't know what we're enhancing or I don't have an idea of what you think we're enhancing.
Let me reframe it for you. I mean, I think what has become an issue is what constitutes enhancement or not. Right? Is it really just a simple binary? I don't think so. I really don't think it is. The acronym we like to use is HOPE. And again, it's a little lofty and it's a little grabby intentionally. So particularly on the neurocognitive side, we talk about neurocognitive hope, where we look at health, occupational protection. In other words, to be protected in the things we occupy ourselves with, and enablement. HOPE. Here, don't look at occupation like my job. What are we occupying our lives with? What are our occupations? What do we occupy with? Interacting with others, family, the work we do, the things we pursue, how we occupy ourselves with the acquisition and distribution, dissemination of knowledge, what we use that knowledge for, and how are we protecting ourselves in those occupations, and how are we doing that in ways that fortify our health. But also, what is that definition of health, and what does that mean, given our self-image and the tools we have? Then we go one step further. In those occupations, perhaps the ways to protect that and to potentiate those occupations is by enabling the things we do and perhaps enabling the things we are, which then gets us back to the whole biosoma issue earlier. That enablement may do two things. Number one, it may accommodate our biological capabilities. And number two, it may compensate for our biological shortcomings and inadequacies. At what point then does that enablement become not just optimization, but enhancement? And at what point does that enhancement become radical modification? This is something, again, John Shook and I have dealt with. We wrote a paper a few years back called Neuroethics Beyond Normal. We deal with some of this in the Bioethics and Brains book, but I think a much more focal, more narrowed, sort of strictured view of that as a concept is in that paper, Neuroethics Beyond Normal. It appears in the Journal of Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics. If I remember right, it was from 2014 and 2016. And I think what it seeks to do is also bring to light the relative ambiguity of the term normal. As a statistical term, what is the norm? What kind of a norm?
Hmm.
Numerical norm?
Hmm.
Probabilized norm?
I had
Norm
to learn
as
the word
standard?
I had to learn normative just to get a handle on ethics. So,
No,
yeah.
it's true. I mean, so do we mean by, I mean, a simple distributional norm, in which case all of it is normal. The whole curve can be considered to be normal. unless we're the ones that set a threshold for acceptability or non-acceptability. But then the other thing is normal in accordance with what?
Mm-hmm.
Normal with accordance with what is for our species, normal in what is accordance with our capability given our species as tool makers. And even if one were to say, wait a minute, we need to draw the line here, because there may be long-standing social, cultural, perhaps even theological traditions. Well, wait a minute. I mean, in many of those traditions, the idea is that humans were created in the image of the creator. Therefore, if I'm in the image of the creator, I'm a creator too, which gets back to Shook and I's point about self-creativity, its capabilities, its constraints, and what that then means for appreciating the rest of us on the planet with regard to citizenship. So all of those things I think fit into that the appreciation of those constructs, not in an esoteric or just academic way, but in a very applicable way in terms of what does this really mean? In terms
Mm-hmm.
of boots on the ground reality, roll your sleeves up and do something about it. Be happy to talk about that next time I'm on. If you
Okay, but yes, I would. And so one last question, and then I'll let you go. In the suggested title, Brain Games, The Barter and Battle for the Mind, may I ask you to elaborate on your choice of the word barter? Battle, it's easy to understand a battle for the mind, but
No, I don't think it is. I
okay.
chose those two. So battle and barter very often exist along a continuum, as I see it. Right? I would imagine in almost every relationship in which we engage, there's some element of barter. The reason for it is quite simple. The factuality is that all relationships are asymmetrical in some way. All of them are. All of them. Right now, you've got the power. You could turn me off like that. You could decide you don't want to interview me ever again. You could come on after this and put on a voiceover that says, I want you to listen to this guy. He is a total boob. And that's powerful. You also have the power to deliver to your audience information that either explicitly or implicitly you endorse, you think is interesting, you think should be good for them. Show me a relationship that is not in some way asymmetrical. I mean, even individuals who appear to be identical, if that's possible, are always going to have some modicum that balances it one way or the other. So, what do we do in our daily engagements? We barter. What have I got that you don't? What do you have that I don't? In essence, it is the basis of, if you will, our relational dynamics. What can I do by myself or not? And how might I interact with you?
Let me
And
ask you,
how,
is this along the lines of transactional? When you,
not just.
okay.
It has a lot to do with the actual nature of reciprocity in altruism and the idea that even altruistic acts have at least a cognitively egoistic, not egotistic, egoistic component. What does it mean to me or for me to do something good for you?
Hmm. Hmm.
Might I recognize that we can work on this together? Is there something of the prisoner's dilemma that I calculate into every sort of aspect of this? This harkens to some of the very excellent work of Paul Glimcher and colleagues that have done sort of work in a field that's been referred to as neuroeconomics. Not necessarily economics like monetary economics, but the exchange of goods, services, and provisions to be able to achieve that level of barter. We do it all the time. Barter represents that nature of cooperativity. How can I literally cooperate and also have some co-optition with things that I may have, things that you may have? What can I use? What can you use? This is how we cognitively negotiate all of the aspects of our life. I cannot necessarily build a motor vehicle, but I know I have to go to work and I therefore buy one or carpool. Even something that simple, if you even think about the fact that humans are what we call altricial animals. In other words, we don't come out of the womb walking, talking, ready to go, but we are dependent upon others, not only for our physical needs, but for our cognitive and social engagement needs. Learning what it takes to fit and interact with others. I can't just take something from you because I want it. That's a bartering system. The human brain is very, very attuned to such levels of barter. Here we relate back to some of the work of Professor Sugru, again Professor Glimcher, some of our own work that looks at the way we construct estimated value of gains versus estimated value of losses across panoply of our experiences and our actions. That's barter. When barter becomes more difficult, when now barter engages competition, and competition now goes one step further to volatilize others' vulnerabilities, now we're talking about conflict. So that spectrum from barter to battle, here I refer the reader to an excellent, a new book by my colleague Dr. Nick Wright, and it basically brings that to the fore. His book is called Warhead. It's a really good book. I mean, what he's saying is there's something intrinsic in about the way humans and perhaps our primate ancestral forebears engage that spectrum of competition, cooperation, conflict, combat. And there's always that level of cooperative competition that others have referred to as co-opetition that involves that level of barter prior to the escalation to what may be belligerence and battle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I gave you that title because I think it represents the full spectrum of the capability of human cognitions, from being exceedingly collaborative and cooperative and congenial to being frankly competitive, conflicting, and combative. And how we use our science and how we use our technologies, inclusive of those that are focal to understanding that embodied brain and its embeddedness in our ecologies and affecting that brain.
Okay. I did have a couple of questions that came up, but I said last question, and I am a woman of my word. So I will look
Next up.
forward. Yes.
Wonderful.
I'll look forward to that. And I thank you. And I hope that you have gotten something out of this. And
With you. I love the questions, and I really do thank you not only for your interest in my work, but your support of it and its advocacy to your audiences. Thanks. I really appreciate it.
all right. Well, I'm looking forward to the next one. And all right. So I said next week, that will be the 23rd, that I'll be speaking with husband and wife Derek and Ula, and we are going to talk about my second edition of the Cutting Through volumes and the fact that it is ready. Well, it will be by the time we talk next week. So I'm looking forward to that, and I thank you for tuning in once again. Take care.
I've got something that the world didn't give me, and the world cannot take it away. And I've got something that the world didn't give me, and the world cannot take it away. Well, it is love, sweet love, oh, sent to me from my Father.